The lone cowboy who rescued a widow and her children said, "I never had a wife." The town of Dry Creek had seen many travelers over the years. Men came looking for work, for gold, for trouble, or for a fresh start. Most of them stayed a few weeks, maybe a month, and then moved on when the wind changed direction. But the man who rode into town one late autumn evening felt different from the start. The sun was setting behind the hills, turning the sky orange and deep purple. Dust followed behind his horse like a fading memory. He did not rush. He did not look around in wonder like newcomers often did. He rode straight down the middle of the quiet street as if he had done it 100 times before in 100 different towns. His hat was old but clean. His coat had been stitched more than once. His boots were worn from long miles. He carried very little with him, just a small saddlebag tied carefully behind his seat. Everything about him spoke of a man who had learned to travel light. Some men sitting outside the saloon paused their conversation to watch him pass. "Another drifter," one of them muttered. "Looks like he's seen hard days," another replied. The stranger did not turn his head. If he heard them, he gave no sign. He stopped in front of the general store and slowly stepped down from his horse. His movements were calm and steady, not the restless energy of someone nervous, but the quiet control of someone used to being alone. He tied the horse carefully, making sure the knot was strong but gentle on the reins. Then he removed his hat for a moment and ran a hand through his dark hair before placing it back on his head. Inside the store, the bell above the door rang softly. Mrs. Parker, who owned the store, looked up from her counter. She was a woman who noticed details. She could often tell a man's story by the way he stood or the way he asked for supplies. "Yes," she asked politely. "I'm looking for a room," he said. His voice was low and even, like someone who measured every word before letting it go. "There's one upstairs," she replied. "Not fancy but clean." "That'll do." He paid in cash without asking the price twice. That small action did not go unnoticed. In small towns, money was often discussed more than weather, but he did not bargain, he did not complain. "What name should I write down?" Mrs. Parker asked, reaching for her book. There was a pause so small most people would not have caught it. "Caleb Stone," he answered. She wrote it down, though something told her that name might not be the one he was born with. Still, she did not ask questions. In Dry Creek, people understood that some stories were carried quietly. Caleb took the key and climbed the wooden stairs. The room upstairs was simple. A narrow bed, a small table, a wash basin, a window that looked over the street. He set his saddlebag down, removed his hat, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long moment he did nothing. He simply listened. The faint sound of laughter from the saloon. The creak of wagon wheels somewhere in the distance. The wind brushing against the building. It was peaceful, too peaceful perhaps. He lay back on the bed without removing his boots. He stared at the ceiling as if it held answers he had been chasing for years. Caleb Stone had been riding for a long time, from one ranch to another, from one town to the next. He took work where he could find it, fixing fences, training horses, moving cattle across wide land that seemed to stretch forever. He was good at it. Quiet, dependable, strong. Ranch owners liked him because he did his job and asked for nothing more than his pay. He never stayed long enough to build friendships. He never stayed long enough to plant roots. The next morning he woke before sunrise. That was his habit. He washed his face with cold water and stepped outside. The air was crisp and carried the scent of dry grass. He walked to the small stable beside the store and checked on his horse first. He always did that before thinking of himself. After making sure the animal was fed and brushed down, he headed toward the edge of town, where a few ranchers often gathered early to discuss work. It didn't take long before he found a group of men loading supplies onto a wagon. "You looking for hands?" Caleb asked calmly. One of the ranchers looked him up and down. "Depends, you know horses." "Yes." "Cattle?" "Yes." "Can you mend fence without wasting half the day?" Caleb gave a small nod. I can. The rancher studied him for a moment longer. 3 days' work, maybe more if you're steady. I'm steady. That was how Caleb began working in Dry Creek. No introductions beyond what was needed, no long conversations, just labor. Over the next few days, people noticed him. He worked harder than most. He didn't brag. He didn't complain about the sun or the dust. When others stopped to rest, he kept moving. When someone dropped a tool, he picked it up without comment. When a horse grew restless, he handled it with patience instead of force. There was a calm strength in him that even the animals seemed to trust. But when the men gathered during breaks and talked about families back home, about wives waiting with warm meals, about children learning to walk or talk, Caleb grew quiet. One afternoon, as they sat under a tree to escape the heat, a younger ranch hand nudged him playfully. "So, Stone," the young man said with a grin, "you got a lady waiting somewhere." The other men chuckled. Caleb took a slow drink from his canteen before answering. "No, never," the young man pressed. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the open fields beyond the fence. The land seemed endless. "I never had a wife," he said simply. There was no humor in his tone, no anger either, just a plain statement like saying the sky was blue. The men sensed something in his voice and did not push further. Conversation shifted to lighter topics. But the words lingered. That evening, Caleb returned to town as the sky began to dim again. He walked past families sitting on porches. He saw a father lifting his small daughter into the air, her laughter bright and free. He saw a woman setting food on a table through an open window while someone inside played a soft tune on a fiddle. For a brief second, his steps slowed. Then he kept walking. Back in his small rented room, he removed his boots and sat by the window. The street below was quieter now. Lanterns flickered softly outside buildings. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, opened and closed many times. He stared at it but did not unfold it tonight. After a moment, he placed it back inside carefully. His life had been built on movement. Staying meant remembering, and remembering was something he had avoided for years. In Dry Creek, people were beginning to notice that the quiet cowboy was different from the others who passed through. He didn't drink much. He didn't gamble. He didn't boast about old adventures. He carried himself like a man who had once hoped for something more and lost it. But no one yet knew how soon that quiet life of drifting would be interrupted. At the far edge of town, beyond the small bridge over the creek, a woman was fighting to protect her land from growing pressure. Trouble was building slowly, like dark clouds gathering on the horizon. And though Caleb Stone did not yet realize it, the road that had always pulled him forward was about to lead him somewhere he had never allowed himself to stay. For the first time in years, fate was not waiting somewhere down the trail. Beyond the small wooden bridge at the edge of Dry Creek, the land opened into wide fields that once looked brighter and more alive. A narrow dirt path led to a modest farmhouse with white paint that had slowly faded under years of sun and wind. The fence around it leaned slightly in places, and the barn showed signs of repair done by careful but tired hands. Still, the place carried a quiet strength, much like the woman who lived there. Mary Collins had not always imagined her life this way. Years ago, the farm had been filled with easy laughter and shared work. Her husband, Daniel, had been the kind of man who woke before dawn with a smile, believing hard work was a blessing rather than a burden. Together, they had built the small farm piece by piece. Every board in the barn, every row in the field, held a memory. But 2 winters ago, a long illness had taken Daniel from them. It had come quietly and stayed longer than anyone expected. By the time spring arrived, Mary was standing alone in the field, holding her children close, knowing life would never be the same. Since then, she had carried responsibilities that once belonged to 2 people. She learned to repair broken tools. She studied how to manage crops more carefully. She kept track of payments, feed supplies, and every small expense. She did not allow herself much rest. There was always something that needed to be done. Her son, Samuel, had grown quickly in those 2 years. At 12, he was tall for his age but still had the uncertain hands of a boy trying to become a man too soon. He tried to lift more than he could carry. He tried to speak with firmness even when doubt sat in his eyes. He loved his mother deeply and hated seeing her tired. Anna, only 7, still held onto childhood in small ways. She collected smooth stones from the creek and kept them in a wooden box beside her bed. She talked to the chickens as if they understood her, yet even she had learned that life required quiet strength. She no longer asked why her father did not come home. The farm survived, but it was not easy. Then Vernon Hale began appearing more often. He was a wealthy landowner whose ranch stretched across large parts of the valley. He dressed neatly and spoke politely, but his words always carried weight. He had been buying smaller farms one by one, offering money that seemed helpful at first glance but never matched the true value of the land. One afternoon, his carriage rolled up Mary's path, wheels turning slowly over the dry ground. Samuel saw it first and ran inside. "Ma," he said quickly, "he's here again." Mary wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. She stood straight, even though her heart tightened at the sight of the man stepping down from his carriage. "Mrs. Collins," Vernon greeted with a small smile. "I hope you've considered my offer." "I have," she replied calmly, "and my answer is still no." Vernon clasped his hands behind his back as he walked a slow circle, examining the property. "You are managing well for now," he said, "but this land requires resources, equipment, protection. I can provide a comfortable future for you and your children." "This farm is their future," Mary answered. "My husband built it. I intend to keep it." His smile faded slightly, though his voice remained smooth. "Sometimes holding on too tightly makes life harder than it needs to be." Mary met his gaze without lowering her eyes. "We are not selling." There was a long silence before he nodded once. "Very well. If you change your mind, you know where to find me." When he left, the air felt heavier. At first, nothing changed. But a week later, Mary noticed that several fence posts along the north field had been knocked loose. She assumed it was wind and repaired them with Samuel's help. 2 days after that, 3 chickens were missing. Then one evening, as the sky turned dark, Samuel rushed inside breathless. "Ma, the barn wall, someone's broken part of it." Mary grabbed a lantern and hurried outside. A section of wood had been forced apart, not by weather but by deliberate hands. The animals were restless, sensing something unusual. Mary stood there quietly, holding the lantern high. She did not cry. She did not shout. She simply understood the message being sent. They were being pressured, but Mary Collins was not someone who gave up easily. The next morning, she woke before sunrise and began repairing the damage. Samuel insisted on helping. Together they worked in silence, the steady sound of hammer against nail filling the early air. By midday, sweat covered Samuel's forehead. He struggled to lift a thick wooden post back into place. It slipped from his grasp and fell heavily into the dirt. He tried again, jaw tight with frustration. That was when the sound of slow hoofbeats approached from the road. Samuel turned and saw a rider drawing closer. The man did not hurry. He simply observed the scene for a moment before guiding his horse toward the fence. It was Caleb Stone. He had been riding back from ranch work when he noticed the broken section from a distance. He saw the boy straining with more weight than he should carry. Without speaking, Caleb stepped down from his horse and walked over. He picked up the fallen post as if it weighed little and positioned it correctly. "Hold it steady," he said quietly. Samuel did as told. Together they secured the post firmly into the ground. Mary approached cautiously, wiping dust from her hands. She studied the stranger. There was something calm about him. He did not look curious or judgmental. He simply worked. "Thank you," she said. He gave a small nod. "Fence won't hold long unless you brace that side too." His voice was steady, practical. Samuel looked at him with admiration. "You fix fences for a living." "Among other things," Caleb replied. Mary hesitated before asking, "What brings you out this way?" "Work," he answered simply. Then he glanced at the barn. His eyes noticed details quickly, the forced wood, the uneven break. This wasn't weather. Mary's silence confirmed it. He did not ask further questions. Instead, he walked toward the damaged barn wall and examined it closely. "You'll need stronger boards here," he said, "and double nails. Otherwise it'll happen again." Mary felt both grateful and embarrassed. She was used to handling problems alone. "I can manage," she said softly. "I'm sure you can," Caleb replied. "Doesn't mean you should have to." There was no pity in his tone, only understanding. That afternoon, he stayed longer than he had planned. He helped reinforce the wall and adjusted the hinges on the barn door. Samuel followed him closely, absorbing every movement. Anna peeked from behind the farmhouse door at first, shy around strangers. But when Caleb gently returned a small wooden doll she had dropped near the yard, she stepped forward a little braver. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat slightly to her. As the sun lowered in the sky, Caleb finally stepped back toward his horse. Mary spoke before he could leave. "You don't have to involve yourself in our troubles." He looked at her for a moment, thoughtful. "Sometimes trouble finds you whether you look for it or not," he said. There was something in his eyes that suggested he knew that truth well. He rode away slowly, dust rising behind him. Mary watched until he disappeared beyond the bend in the road. For the first time in many months, she felt something unfamiliar, relief. But she also knew the problem had not ended. Vernon Hale was not a man who accepted refusal easily. That night, as wind moved gently across the fields, Mary stood by her window, looking toward the distant town lights. She wondered whether the quiet cowboy would return. She did not yet know that his arrival had already shifted something important. Not just in her life. After that afternoon, Caleb told himself he would not return to the farm too often. He had only meant to help with the fence, nothing more. That was how he had always lived, help when needed, then move on before roots could grow. But the next morning, as he rode out toward the ranch where he had been hired, his horse slowed near the same dirt path that led to Mary's land. Caleb did not pull the reins. He let the horse choose its pace. From a distance, he saw Samuel trying to guide a stubborn mule across the yard. The animal refused to move, digging its hooves into the ground. Samuel pulled harder, growing frustrated. Caleb rode closer. "Don't fight him," he said calmly. "You'll only make him more stubborn." Samuel looked up, surprised but pleased to see him. "He won't listen." Caleb stepped down and approached the mule slowly. He placed a steady hand on its neck and spoke in a low, even tone. Within moments, the animal relaxed. "You don't force respect," Caleb explained. "You earn it." Samuel nodded as if those words meant more than just animal training. Mary stepped out of the house, noticing them. This time she did not look as cautious. She offered a small smile. "You're becoming a regular visitor," she said. "Just passing through," Caleb replied. But even he knew that was no longer fully true. Over the next few days, his visits became more natural. Sometimes he brought small supplies from town, extra nails, a stronger rope, a better latch for the barn door. He never made a show of it. He simply handed them over as if it were no big matter. Samuel followed him everywhere. He asked questions about riding, about open land beyond Dry Creek, about cattle drives and distant mountains. "Have you ever been to the coast?" Samuel asked one afternoon while they fixed a loose gate. "Yes." "What's it like?" "Loud," Caleb answered. "The ocean never stops moving." Samuel grinned. "I'd like to see that one day." Caleb looked at the boy thoughtfully. "You will. Just don't rush growing up to get there." The words came out before he could stop them. Samuel didn't fully understand, but Mary, who was hanging laundry nearby, did. Caleb noticed the changes around the farm more clearly now. The broken boards had not been accidents. The missing tools had not been carelessness. Someone was watching, testing. waiting. One afternoon, as clouds gathered in the distance, Caleb found Mary near the barn checking the animals. "You've had more trouble?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "A few supplies disappeared last night. Nothing major, but enough." "Did you see anyone?" "No, but I don't need to guess." They both knew who was behind it. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed steady. "You planning to report it?" "To who?" Mary replied gently. "No one saw anything, and Vernon Hale is respected in town." Caleb looked toward the hills beyond the property. "Respect can be loud, truth is quieter." Mary studied him. "Why do you care?" The question hung between them longer than expected. Finally he said, "I don't like seeing people pushed." "That happens everywhere," she said. "Doesn't mean it should." There was firmness in his tone now. Not anger, not pride, just principle. Days passed. Word began spreading in town that the quiet cowboy had been spending time at the Collins farm. Some people approved. Others warned him to stay out of matters that did not concern him. At the saloon one evening, a ranch hand leaned close and said, "Hale doesn't like interference." Caleb took a slow sip of water. Then he should stop interfering. The ranch hand shook his head. "You don't know how this valley works." Caleb met his eyes calmly. "I know enough." Meanwhile, at the farm, the children grew comfortable around him. Anna would wait by the gate whenever she saw dust rising on the road. She began telling him about her collection of creek stones. One day she handed him a small, smooth rock. "For good luck," she said seriously. He turned it over in his hand. "You sure you want to give this away?" She nodded. "You might need it more." He kept it. One late afternoon, as golden light stretched across the fields, Samuel asked a question that caught Caleb off guard. "Mr. Stone," he began carefully, "why don't you have a family?" Caleb paused, tightening a saddle strap before answering. "Life moves fast." "That doesn't answer it," Samuel said honestly. Caleb leaned against the fence and looked out at the land. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. "Some men," he said slowly, "don't stop long enough to build something lasting." Samuel frowned slightly. "Didn't you want to?" There it was. The question Caleb had avoided for years. He could have brushed it off, could have changed the subject. But something about the open sky and the honest face of the boy made him speak the truth. "I never had a wife," he said quietly. Samuel waited, expecting more. Caleb continued, voice softer now. "There was someone once, long time ago, but I kept choosing the road. Thought there'd always be more time." "What happened?" Samuel asked. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the horizon. "Time doesn't always wait." Samuel fell silent. He sensed the weight behind the words. From the porch, Mary had heard enough to understand. She did not interrupt. That evening, tension rose higher than before. Two riders approached the farm just before sunset. They were men who worked for Vernon Hale. Their horses kicked up dust as they stopped near the gate. "We're here about overdue fees," one of them announced loudly. Mary stepped forward. "There are no overdue fees. That's not what our records say." Caleb moved closer, though he did not step in front of her. He stood beside her instead. "Show the records," he said calmly. The man looked at him with annoyance. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Caleb replied. There was no threat in his voice, but there was certainty. The second rider glanced at the reinforced barn wall and the repaired fences. He understood that the farm was no longer as vulnerable as before. "You'd better be careful who you stand with," the first rider warned. Caleb's expression did not change. "Careful is exactly what I'm being." The men lingered for a moment, trying to decide how far to push, but something in Caleb's steady gaze made them reconsider. They turned their horses and rode away without another word. When the dust settled, Anna ran to Mary and held her hand tightly. Mary exhaled slowly. "They'll be back." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but not the same way." Samuel looked up at him with new respect. "You're not scared of them." Caleb rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Everyone feels fear. You just decide whether it leads you or not." That night, Caleb did not return immediately to town. He stayed until the sky grew dark, making sure no one else approached. He sat near the fence line, listening to the quiet sounds of animals settling in. Mary brought him a cup of warm coffee. "You don't owe us this," she said softly. He looked at the farmhouse, at the faint light glowing from the windows, at the children moving inside. "Maybe I owe myself," he replied. "For what? For not staying when I should have." Mary understood more than he realized. She did not ask about the past again. Some stories unfold slowly. As Caleb finally rode back toward Dry Creek under the star-filled sky, he felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. He had spent years believing that staying in one place only led to regret, that caring too deeply only led to loss. But now, as the cool night air brushed against his face, he could not ignore the truth. He was no longer just passing through. And for the first time in a long while, that thought did not feel like a burden. It felt like possibility. The tension in the valley did not disappear after that evening. It only grew quieter, like a storm building behind distant hills. Dry Creek continued its daily routine. Wagons rolled down the main street, children ran between buildings, and shopkeepers opened their doors at sunrise. But beneath the normal sounds of town life, people were watching, waiting. Caleb felt it. He noticed how conversations stopped when he entered certain places. He noticed how Vernon Hale's men rode past the Collins farm more often than necessary. They did not always stop. Sometimes they simply slowed their horses, looking over the land as if measuring it. Mary continued working as she always had. She refused to show fear in front of her children. But when she thought no one was looking, her shoulders carried the weight of constant worry. One afternoon, thick gray clouds gathered faster than expected. The air became heavy and still. Even the animals sensed something unusual. Chickens moved closer to the barn. The horses shifted nervously. Caleb had just finished helping Samuel reinforce part of the north fence when he looked up at the sky. "That's not a small storm," he said. Mary stepped outside and followed his gaze. The clouds were darker than usual, rolling over each other in restless waves. "We've had worse," she said quietly, though her voice held uncertainty. The wind came first, strong, sudden, and cold. It swept across the fields, bending tall grass almost flat. Dust rose in spinning circles. Loose boards rattled against the barn walls. "Get the animals secured," Caleb said firmly. "Now." Samuel ran toward the stable. Anna hurried inside to close the shutters. Mary grabbed extra rope and followed Caleb toward the barn. Rain began falling in heavy drops, turning the dirt yard into mud within minutes. Thunder echoed across the valley, deep and powerful. Inside the barn, the animals were restless. One horse kicked at the wooden wall. A beam overhead creaked loudly. Caleb moved quickly but calmly. "Tie them lower, keep them steady." Samuel did as he was told, though his hands shook slightly. The storm outside grew louder, wind pushing against the structure with force. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound filled the barn. Mary looked up just as part of the roof shifted. Water poured through a new opening. "That beam won't hold," Caleb said. Before anyone could react further, a heavy wooden support near the entrance gave way. It fell toward Samuel. Time seemed to slow. Caleb lunged forward and shoved the boy aside. The beam struck Caleb's shoulder instead, knocking him to one knee. Mary gasped. Samuel scrambled back, eyes wide. "I'm fine," Caleb said quickly through clenched teeth. "Move the animals out. Now." Ignoring his pain, he pushed himself up and helped guide the frightened animals through the barn doors into a more open area away from falling debris. Rain soaked through his coat instantly. Wind whipped against them, nearly stealing their balance. Mary held Anna tightly as they hurried toward the farmhouse. "Inside," Caleb called out. They managed to secure the animals behind a makeshift barrier near the house. The barn roof continued to tear under the pressure of the storm. For what felt like hours, they worked together, dragging equipment away from danger, securing loose items, blocking windows from the inside. Finally, near dawn, the storm began to weaken. The wind slowed. The thunder moved farther away. Silence returned slowly, broken only by dripping water and distant rumbling. The farm looked battered. Part of the barn roof had collapsed. Several fence sections were down again. Mud covered nearly everything. Mary stepped outside, her boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. She looked at the damage, breathing deeply to steady herself. Samuel stood beside her, quiet. Caleb walked out a moment later, holding his shoulder stiffly. "You should sit," Mary said firmly when she noticed the way he moved. "It's nothing," he replied. "It's not nothing." She guided him inside despite his resistance. He finally allowed himself to sit at the kitchen table while she examined his shoulder carefully. It was bruised but not broken. "You saved him," Mary said softly. Caleb looked toward Samuel, who stood in the doorway listening. "Anyone would have," he replied, but they both knew that wasn't true. As Anna brought a cloth for her mother, she looked at Caleb with wide eyes. "You didn't even think," she said. He managed a faint smile. "Thinking sometimes takes too long." The storm had not been caused by any person. It was nature, wild and uncontrollable. Yet it reminded them how fragile everything could be. Later that afternoon, as they began clearing debris, a wagon approached from town. Several neighbors stepped down, bringing extra tools and supplies. "We heard about the storm damage," one of them said. "Figured you could use a hand." Mary blinked in surprise. "Thank you." The neighbors worked together without complaint. Word had spread quickly, not just about the storm, but about how Caleb had stood up to Hale's men days earlier. The town was beginning to shift. Vernon Hale arrived as well, though not with tools. He stepped carefully through the mud, surveying the damage with narrowed eyes. "Terrible storm," he said smoothly. "Repairs like this can be costly." Mary straightened. "We'll manage." Hale's gaze shifted to Caleb, who stood nearby despite his injury. "You seem very invested here," Hale observed. Caleb met his eyes calmly. "Storms affect everyone." Hale's smile was thin. "Some storms are preventable, others are not." There was meaning behind the words, but no direct threat. Mary spoke before tension could rise further. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Hale, but we'll handle our repairs." He gave a small nod and returned to his wagon, clearly displeased. After he left, one of the neighbors leaned closer to Caleb. "He doesn't like losing control." "Then maybe it's time he gets used to it," Caleb replied quietly. As days passed, the farm slowly returned to order. Caleb worked despite his sore shoulder, refusing to rest more than necessary. Samuel stayed close, learning every repair technique. One evening, as the sun set behind repaired fence lines, Mary found Caleb sitting alone near the edge of the field. The sky was painted in soft orange and pink. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said gently, sitting beside him. He stared ahead for a moment before speaking. "I used to believe staying anywhere was a mistake," he admitted. "Thought if I kept moving, nothing could tie me down. And now," she asked, he exhaled slowly, "now I'm not so sure." The breeze moved lightly across the grass. "There was someone once," he continued quietly. "She wanted a life like this, a home. I kept saying we'd settle down after one more job, one more season, but I never stopped writing. By the time I realized what mattered, she was gone from my life." Mary listened without interrupting. "I never had a wife," he said again, softer this time. "Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't stay." There was regret in his voice, but also honesty. Mary looked toward the farmhouse where the children's laughter drifted faintly through the air. "Sometimes," she said gently, "life gives second chances in ways we don't expect." Caleb turned slightly toward her. "I don't know how to be what they need," he admitted. "You already are," she replied. He did not answer right away. For years, he had measured himself by miles traveled and jobs completed. Now he was being measured by something deeper: trust, protection, presence. As the stars began appearing one by one in the darkening sky, Caleb realized something had changed inside him during that storm. He had not stepped in front of danger because he felt responsible. He had done it because he cared, and caring meant risk. But for the first time in a long time, the risk did not frighten him. It gave him purpose. The road that once called him forward now felt distant. For the first time, staying did not feel like a trap. It felt like strength. The storm had passed, but its mark remained on the land and in the hearts of everyone who lived in the valley. The Collins farm stood again, not perfect, not untouched, but stronger than before. The broken boards had been replaced. The fences stood straighter. The animals were calm once more, but something else had changed too. People were no longer pretending not to see what had been happening. Neighbors who once kept their distance now stopped by more often. Some brought small gifts, fresh bread, extra seeds, spare tools. Others came simply to talk. They stood a little longer than before, their eyes carrying quiet understanding. Vernon Hale noticed this shift. For years, he had relied on silence. When one farmer felt pressure, the others stayed quiet. When one family struggled, others told themselves it was not their business. That silence had made him powerful. But now, silence was beginning to break. One morning, Hale called a meeting at the town hall. Word spread quickly. Farmers, shopkeepers, and workers gathered inside the wooden building. The air felt tense but determined. Mary almost did not attend. She disliked public confrontation, but Samuel insisted. "If we don't stand there," he said firmly, "he'll think we're afraid." Caleb offered to go in her place. "No," Mary replied. "This land belongs to my family. I will stand for it." They walked into town together. Anna held Mary's hand tightly. Caleb walked beside them, not ahead, not behind. Inside the hall, Vernon Hale stood near the front, dressed neatly as always. He spoke smoothly about progress, about growth, about how combining lands under one management would bring prosperity to Dry Creek. Some nodded uncertainly, others looked down at the floor. Then Hale's voice shifted slightly. "Of course," he added, "those who resist cooperation may find it difficult to maintain their properties long term." It was not a direct threat, but everyone understood. Mary stepped forward before fear could settle. "My husband built our farm with his own hands," she said clearly. "We have paid our taxes. We have repaired what was damaged. We have followed every rule. We are not refusing cooperation. We are refusing pressure." The room grew very quiet. Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Collins, I have only offered assistance." "With conditions," she replied. A murmur moved through the crowd. Then something unexpected happened. Old Mr. Harper, whose farm bordered Mary's land, stood up slowly. "He came to me too," he admitted, "offered less than my land is worth." Another farmer spoke next. "Same here." One by one, voices rose, different stories, similar patterns. Caleb watched quietly from the side. He did not speak first. This was not his land, it was theirs. Finally, Hale turned toward him. "And you, Mr. Stone, you seem to have made yourself part of this matter." Caleb met his gaze calmly. "I work where I'm hired," he said, "and I stand where I believe is right." "That's a bold position for a man with no roots here," Hale replied. Caleb did not raise his voice. "Roots don't grow because of fear," he said. "They grow because the ground is treated fairly." There was strength in his words, but no anger. That calm certainty carried weight. The meeting did not end with shouting. It ended with agreement. The townspeople decided to review land records openly and support one another if unfair pressure continued. They would not act separately anymore. Hale realized his influence was no longer unquestioned. He left the hall without another word. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. With the town standing united, Hale's quiet tactics stopped. Broken fences were no longer damaged again. Supplies no longer disappeared. The pressure faded. Dry Creek felt lighter. At the Collins farm, life settled into a steady rhythm. Caleb stayed. He no longer told himself it was temporary. He repaired the remaining barn roof fully. He built stronger gates. He even carved a small wooden swing for Anna and hung it from a sturdy tree near the house. When Anna first sat on it, she laughed so loudly that birds flew from the nearby branches. Samuel grew more confident each day. Under Caleb's guidance, he learned not just ranch skills but patience, responsibility, calm thinking. One evening, as they worked side by side brushing down a horse, Samuel asked quietly, "Are you going to leave?" The question was simple, but it carried deep meaning. Caleb paused before answering. "For a long time," he said, "I thought leaving was easier." "And now?" Samuel pressed. Caleb looked toward the farmhouse where warm light glowed through the windows. "Now I think staying might take more courage." Samuel smiled slightly. "I'm glad you're brave." Caleb chuckled softly. Later that night, as the sky filled with stars, Mary found Caleb sitting on the porch steps. The air was cool but peaceful. "You've changed this place," she said gently. He shook his head. "It was strong before I got here." "It was surviving," she corrected. "Now it's living." They sat in silence for a moment. "I never thought I would stay anywhere," Caleb admitted. "Every town felt like a stop on a road that never ended." Mary looked at him carefully. "What were you running from?" He considered the question. "Regret," he answered honestly. "I kept thinking I had more time, more chances. I never had a wife because I never allowed myself to build something steady. I kept choosing distance." "And do you still want distance?" she asked softly. He turned toward her fully now. "No." The word was simple but carried years of wandering behind it. Anna suddenly opened the door and ran outside barefoot. "You're both sitting in the dark," she announced. Then she climbed into Caleb's lap without hesitation. "You're not alone anymore," she said confidently, resting her head against his chest. Caleb froze for just a second, surprised by the closeness. Then slowly, carefully, he wrapped one arm around her to steady her. Mary watched the moment quietly. For years, Caleb had believed that staying meant weakness, that caring deeply meant risking loss he could not bear. But now he understood something different. Leaving had not protected him from pain. It had only protected him from love. As weeks turned into months, the farm became more than a place of work. It became home. Caleb no longer kept his saddlebag packed and ready. He unpacked it fully for the first time in years. The folded piece of paper he had carried for so long, he finally opened it one evening. It was an old letter from the woman he once loved. He read it quietly under the lantern light, then folded it again, not with sadness but with peace. He placed it in a small wooden box instead of back in his bag. The road beyond Dry Creek still stretched wide and endless. Travelers still passed through town, but Caleb Stone no longer felt pulled by that road. One quiet morning, as sunlight rose over the fields, Mary joined him near the fence line. "You once said you never had a wife," she said gently. He smiled slightly. "Maybe," he replied, "I just hadn't found where I belonged." She stepped closer, her voice steady. "And have you?" Caleb looked around, the repaired barn, the strong fences, Samuel leading a horse confidently across the yard, Anna laughing on her swing. "Yes," he said. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like a man who had arrived. And in that simple, steady moment, the lone cowboy who once believed he was meant to ride alone finally understood something greater than distance. Home was not a place you stumbled upon. It was a place you chose to stay, and he chose to stay.